Chapter 2. The Story of Pandora. In the early days of man's life on earth, when everything was beautiful and new, there was no sickness anywhere, nor any pain, nor sorrow. Men lived to be very old and very wise, and everywhere was happiness as had never been seen before in the world. Now Jupiter had not forgotten about the stealing of the sacred fire, and it angered him that man should light his own fires and kindle the cheerful blaze, of which should be brightly glowing only in the halls of Mount Olympus. The suffering of Prometheus had not softened his wrath. He would not be satisfied until punishment was visited upon those who had received the stolen fire. Accordingly, he called a council of the gods and spoke to them of his desire. Though none of the deities wished to see misfortune brought upon the race of man, they did not dare dispute the will of Jupiter. So they agreed to carry out the plan that he unfolded. And before many days had passed, they had fashioned, out of the same clay from which man was made, a creature that they called woman. To her each of the gods gave a gift such as softness, or grace, or wonderful fairness. But Jupiter added another quality, curiosity, and he gave the name of Pandora, which means the gift of all gods. Then he bade Mercury, who is the messenger of the gods, take this new soft thing down to earth and give her to Epidemius for his wife. Now Epidemius had mourned apart from his fellows ever since he had learned of his brother's dreadful fate, and he sat day and night in cool silence in the forest, brooding over his sorrow. But one day he saw someone coming towards him, led by the hand of Mercury, and all at once he forgot to be sad, for the sunlight was shining on the woman's golden hair, and her white arm was stretched out to him in greeting. For some time Epithemius and Pandora lived happily in the gardens of earth, and every day Epithemius thanked the gods for the last and best gift to man. He never tired of watching Pandora chasing butterflies through the tall meadow grass, or making cups of broad leaves, that she and Epithemius might drink from the cool spring. One day, as they were resting under the trees and eating their simple meal of dates and wild honey, they saw a traveler coming towards them. He was walking very slowly, and seemed heavily burdened with what appeared to be a large box. While he was yet some distance off, Pandora ran to meet him and asked him to come into the shade and rest. The stranger was old, and the chest he carried bent his shoulders almost to the ground. He looked hungry and thirsty and tired, so Epithemius urged him to stop and rest, and offered him some of the freshly gathered dates. But the traveler, who was none other than Mercury in disguise, replied that he could not tarry with them, for he had a long distance yet to go. He asked them, however, to take care of his great oak chest, for with that burden off his shoulders he could hurry and reach his journey's end before nightfall. He promised to come back for the chest a few days later. Epithemius and Pandora were delighted to be of service to a stranger, and promised to guard the chest with great care. The traveler thanked them and turned away, but just as they were saying goodbye, he mysteriously disappeared, and whichever way they looked, there was no trace of him to be seen. Epithemius was not at all eager to know what was in the mysterious chest, but as soon as they sat down again under the trees, Pandora began to ask 1,000 questions as to who the traveler might be and what the chest contained. Epithemius begged her not to think any more about it, as nothing could be learned of the old man or his burden. But Pandora refused to be silenced, and talked still more of the possible treasure that they were guarding for the stranger. At last Epithemius got angry and walked away, wearied by her insistence. Pandora then walked over to the chest, and kneeling down beside it, she examined the exquisitely carved figures that were on all four sides. Then she studied the fine golden cord that bound the chest. It looked soft enough, and yet it was very strong, for it was made of strands of twisted gold and tied at the end with a curious knot. There was no lock to be seen, and apparently nothing hindered her eager fingers from opening the lid once the knot was unfastened, and the golden cord unwound. Pandora's fingers itched to try her skill on the knot, and she felt sure that if she looked at it long enough, she could finally loosen it. The figures carved on the lid were groups of dancing children, and in the very center was one figure whose face was so strange that Pandora sat for a long time staring at it. Now and then she turned away, and when she looked at the face again, it had a different expression than the one she had seen on it before. She knew that this carved thing was not alive, and yet each time she gazed into the strange eyes of the wooden face, they were quite unlike the eyes that had smiled or frowned or mocked her before. She went to see whether Epimetheus had come back, and finding that he was still away, she returned to the chest again, but would not let herself be tempted into so much as touching the golden cord. As she stood there wondering what to do, she thought that she heard some little voices coming from inside the chest. They seemed to say, "Open, Pandora, please, please open and let us out." Pandora looked quickly around to see whether Epimetheus was in sight. Then she came a bit nearer to the chest and put one hand on the golden cord. And again she heard small voices. This time, very distinctly, they said, "Open, Pandora, please. Please open and let us out." Pandora's heart was now beating fast. What could be in the chest? What poor imprisoned creatures were calling to her, begging for her to set them free? She put both hands on the golden cord, and she looked guiltily around, but no one was in sight. No one was watching her except for some inquisitive squirrels who were peering down at her from the branches just above her head. Swiftly and deftly she untied the knot, which yielded easily to her eager fingers. But even then she hesitated, fearing the anger of Epimetheus. The little voices called again, "Open, Pandora, please, please open and let us out." But still she hesitated, not daring to raise the lid. Just then she heard her husband calling to her, and she knew that there would be no more chance now to explore the contents of the mysterious chest. She must wait for that pleasure until another time. Meanwhile, she would just take one peep inside, just to make sure that the voices were not mocking her. So she raised the lid very gently. But no sooner had she made the smallest opening than out poured a host of tiny creatures like brown-winged moths, and they swarmed all around her, biting and pinching and blistering her soft skin, until she cried out in fear and pain. She tried to fight them off, and she rushed away to find Epimetheus, but the tormenting little sprites followed her, buzzing about her ears and stinging her again and again. In vain she strove to brush them away, for they clung to her dress, her hair, her poor swollen skin. When she reached Epimetheus, she was crying bitterly, and it did not need a question to find out the trouble, for the malicious little creatures were so numerous that hundreds of them encircled Epimetheus, and bit and stung him, just as they had done to Pandora. In the unhappy hour that followed, while husband and wife bound soothing herbs on their bruised skin, Pandora told Epimetheus how her fatal curiosity had led her to opening the chest and set free the host of evil things. It was not, however, until again later that they realized the extent of Pandora's folly, for the little brown winged creatures were all the sprites of evil that had never before entered the world. Their names were Sickness and Pain and Sorrow, Envy and Pride, and Jealousy, Hunger, Poverty, and Death, and all these ills had envied Jupiter, and he had put them into the chest and bound it with only a golden cord. He knew that sooner or later Pandora would open the chest, and then man's life of untroubled happiness would be forever at an end. Never again could the gardens of earth be places where man might hope to find peace. Evil things had taken up their dwelling there, and they would stay for always and always and always, as long as the world should last. When Epimetheus and Pandora saw the hateful winged creatures settling down on the leaves and flowers, so as to be near at hand to torment them, they wept bitter tears, and wished that the gods had never created them. In the midst of her sobbing, Pandora had not, however, forgotten about the chest, and she was still wondering what else might be inside, for she was sure that those moth things could never have wholly filled it. Suddenly, she heard a wee soft whisper coming from within the chest, and it said, "Open, Pandora, please, please open and let me out." Pandora stared in surprise, for she thought that all the evil sprites had rushed out in the moment when she had lifted the lid. Was there then another host of tormenting things still in there? And if so, should she let them out and add to her misery and pain? Again the soft little voice cried, Open, Pandora, please, please open and let me out. Pandora now called to Epithemius, and together they listened to the pleading, soft voice, which was so very soft and so sweet that they were sure it could not belong to any evil thing. Still, Epithemius was unwilling to risk bringing any more trouble into the world. But, in spite of her remorse, Pandora was curious to see what it was that was begging so plaintively to be free. So, with Epithemius's consent, she opened the lid once more, and out fluttered a tiny little creature with beautiful gauzy wings. She flew straight to Pandora, then to Epithemius, and at her touch all their hurts were healed, and all their pains forgotten. The name of this gentle messenger was Hope, and she had been hidden in the chest secretly by one of the pitying goddess, who grieved that Jupiter was sending so many ills to fret mankind. The host of evil beings once set free could never again be shut up in their narrow prison, but wherever they flew, even to the remotest corner of the earth, Hope followed them and brought healing in her wings. And when the world grew wicked, as it did in the days to come after, so that men neglected the altar of the gods, Hope still remembered devoted offerings, and her shrines kept garlanded with flowers. End of chapter 2.